Welcome to All Waves Considered. On this episode, we are talking to Owen Atkey. Enjoy.
Father time, I hear the tick, 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 ticking of your clock.
I was a young kid from the prairies, and I grew up on the west coast of Vancouver Island in a little town, Tofino, which is out in the middle of nowhere. And it's full of loggers, fishermen, and natives, and hippies. And imagine growing up at that time, the big music scene was the Beach Boys. So everybody's going surfing. The Rolling Stones, first album. All this music, the whole thing. And surfing got dragged right into the middle of it. Right into the summer of love. In the middle of all this, my older brother was one of the pioneers of surfing in Western Canada, took a trip to Hawaii, and he met Fred Hemmings, and he watched Waimea. He went to Australia, learned to surf, and was completely ruined his whole life, just like that. So then he came back to Canada and started to ruin my life as a young kid. I was probably 11 years old. We had these clunky, funky old single fin Bing longboards, beaver tail wetsuits. Unbelievable. We're trying to surf up there at some of the famous Canadian breaks, Jordan River, Sombrios, up in Tofino. Everybody was pumped, listened to the music, big fires around the beach. This was not Hawaii. This was not what I saw with the bikini girls. We had women in raincoats. It was a whole different scene. The smell of fish blood, fish guts everywhere. It was cold, freezing. You literally would have ice cream headaches. Anyway, it was just way too much for me. So I ended up heading south as a young kid, disillusioned, hitchhiked my way south. Imagine that. Ended up in Mexico, ended up in Mazatlan, and I started seeing the guys surfing warm water, and I started catching on to it. And I liked it. But I really liked body surfing. So I started going into body surfing. We surfed a lot of the places in Mexico. We went down to Petacalco. We surfed there. We went to Puerto Escondido, pre-tri-fin days. This is when there was just 6 or 8 guys with single fins on the beach. We would go out and body surf with no fins, just trunks, and get thrown over these giant... I still can't believe I did it. I'm still alive. We'd get pounded the crap out of us. And the surfers that were there, they couldn't believe how crazy we were. But that was one of the body surfing meccas of the world. It's one of the best places. And I used to watch these guys ride on these pocket rockets. I was 15 at this time, 15 years old. I'd had an exposure to surfing on boards in Canada, which didn't really add up to much, except a frozen nightmare. And now I'm getting completely into body surfing, and I'm meeting some really good body surfers, and I'm meeting a lot of surfers and starting to understand the culture of surfing in the tropics. Go back to Canada. I'm working on a fish boat. I'm making money, dreaming about getting back to the tropics at the tender age of 16, the beautiful Latino girls, the cold beer. I'd work my ass off. People say, why are you working so hard? He says, come October, man, I'm out of here. You watch me, I'm going south. That's what happened. My brother said to me, why are you so excited? I says, I'm going back to Mexico and heading south. And he says, well, is there waves down there? And I said, yeah, there's waves. He says, well, maybe I ought to come down there. He says, well, why don't you come down and I'll show you around. So basically, that year I took off again, hitchhiking, ended up in Mazatlan, and I met a Guadalcanal war vet. This is 1969. I met a Guadalcanal war vet who was shell-shocked, and he had a brand new 69 Bel Air 6-cylinder Chevy with 6-foot seats in it that 2 guys could sleep in. And he was as crazy as me, and we decided to drive this thing to Rio de Janeiro. So we got in his car in Mazatlan and started driving south. That's where it all began. There was nothing stopped me. We ended up in Costa Rica. That's when I discovered this area here. And I came in here on a boat. It was before the pangas from Mexico even showed up here. The boats were made out of, they were called cayucos, and they were made out of balsa wood or big trees. We came in on a 30-foot cayuco loaded with pigs, rice and beans, and people, with about 6 inches of freeboard, and it had a one-banger East Hope diesel in it. And we left Punta Arenas, and it took over 12 hours to get to Manzanillo. And you'd stop in every place along the way. You'd stop in Paquera and Tambor, and you'd stop in Pachote and Cabuya and Montezuma, Malpais, and then they'd end up in Manzanillo. And then I realized there was guys landing airplanes on the beach, and you could fly out here. And there would be ox carts on the beach that would pick you up like taxis. Because this is when I got here, there was no cars here. There was nothing here. I spent over a month, 2 months in this area, and we camped out, walked around, just explored this whole area, Malpais. We would walk the beaches at night in the full moon. There was nothing between Malpais and Manzanillo was a little town. And Malpais, we'd walk there, and there was a little tiny village there. We'd buy some stuff once in a while. We'd walk to Cobano. The only thing you could buy was candles, sardines, and matches. And they had campfine refrigerators where you could get a cold beer and a cold Coke and some cookies. And you'd drink 2 or 3 of those, and you'd get sick, grab your shit, and walk home. People would ask me, what did you do all day? And I said, we looked for food all day. We'd go fishing. We'd go look for fruit trees. I mean, it was a great experience. But basically, I wrapped up and went back to Canada. I just loved this area. It was a magical place because there was no cars. I thought I had gone back into history. It was just ox carts and horses, and it was like going into a historical novel. So then I went back to Canada, and now I'm really motivated. So I went back, went commercial fishing again, went back to the dry docks, saving every dollar I had, ended up going up working on the oil fields, worked pipelining up in Alberta, and I'm down there in a ditch, 8 feet underground, working with these welders, and they're going, what the fuck are you doing here? I says, I'm saving money because I'm going down where the fucking palm trees are. And these guys are going, tell us all about those beautiful girls and those palm trees, you know. And it was so funny. So then I bought an old car, a 1965 Dodge Start, and I fucking jumped in that thing and started driving. And we drove that thing all the way down to Costa Rica. We surfed our way all the way down through Mexico. We surfed Baja, caught the ferry to Puerto Vallarta. We surfed Punta Mita before there was any development there at all. We would just string our hammocks up in the trees and surf the reef breaks out front and the point when it broke and the inside breaks. Then we just worked our way down through Mexico and got to El Salvador. That was it. I mean, it was a situation where I really learned how to surf in El Salvador, in Sunsal. My brother was with me. And some of the old timers were there, and it was an amazing time. The surf was just pumping. Surfing a perfect point break for 2 weeks in a row when you're fucking jacked up, you actually learn how to surf. So that was it. My life was ruined too. So I brought my brother down here to Costa Rica, and he fell in love with the place. So we started exploring down here. So then that's when we went to Pavones. And when we got to Pavones, this was back in 1972. It was before Danny Fowley and his crew showed up. And we went there, and there was an old fucker living there, a guy named Winford, an old German guy who was another surfer. This is way back, old surfer. He was a crazy German guy that learned to surf over in Europe, in the Azores. He sold his sailboat in the Caribbean for a surf map that showed all these secret surf breaks on the west coast of Costa Rica. And the one there was a point break on his map, Pavones, that he saw. So he came and squatted and bought land out in the middle of Barica out there. But this guy was completely out of his mind. Winford. We went out and lived with him for a while and surfed Pavones. We had 2 surfboards, and we broke one, so we'd have to we'd have to share one board. And then we explored all over the country, but we loved it here in Santa Teresa and Hermosa. We used to live in Hermosa and we lived on the beach. We never saw another person. Maybe every 2 weeks somebody come by. There was nothing between Manzanillo and Malpais. It was one big ranch. And I literally never even wore any clothes. Half the time we just surfed naked. Every year I would come and explore, and I'd leave my car in the aduanas in San Jose, and I would go to Colombia, and I would travel all over South America looking for a place, because I believed that South America was just like this, but it wasn't. I looked everywhere. I went to Ecuador, I went to Colombia, I went to Peru, I went to Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia. I looked everywhere. I traveled around for years down there. Every year I'd go down there for 2 or 3 months, and I'd come back and get my car and drive back north, and I would stop and surf all the way home. I'd surf El Salvador, drive back through Mexico, and get back to Canada and jump back on the fish boat and go back and go fishing. So basically I got into this cycle of yearly trips where I would save money, buy an old car, come down. One time we bought a car for $50. We bought the tires off the RCMP squad car, half-used radials for $50. We threw those on the car. We used to call them one-way cars. If they broke down, we would just leave them and keep going. But they never broke down. The one GMC truck we drove down here, we had the best time in that sucker. We drove that back. When I got back to Canada that year, every gear was blown out, and the sink, we had to double clutch every gear. I hadn't had a battery in the car for 3 months. We had to push start it everywhere we went. Oh, it was hilarious. I was with my friend. We were driving around in El Salvador. It was about 110 degrees out. We got 3 flat tires at one time. And I looked over it. I said, I guess it's time we need to buy some tires, Pete. We basically had a lot of fun. After a couple of trips down this way, I would go back to Canada. The whole surf situation, I mean, to keep focused on the surf, was evolving in Canada. So now I'm surfing in Canada. I'm charging out down surfing down into areas that are like, my brother and I were pioneering surf breaks up on the west coast of Vancouver Island that are now famous. We'd go up there, living up there with the natives. It was an amazing, beautiful experience, except it's Canada. It's not the tropics. It's cold. The summers are nice. You wait a lot of, it's a lot of waiting around, a lot of ice cream headaches, storms, lots of wind. We all know about the Pacific Northwest. So the tropical thing was always in my mind. My motivation to come down here was the people. I loved the Latinos. I was very early to learn the language. I listened to the radio. I read the newspapers. I learned how to speak Spanish as fast as I could. I made it a point to learn a new word every day, and not just learn it, to go out and use it and make sure it was being used properly. And I loved the people. I loved all the challenges of crossing the border, staring down the machine guns and getting the guys to laugh. I knew that humor was the only way that you were going to get through some of the most horrible situations. And believe me, there was a lot of horrible situations. So basically, I learned how to survive in this environment. It became second nature to me. I would go back to Canada. I remember I would go to Oaxaca, and I would load up my water tank in my van with mezcal and drive it across the border. And my dad would just laugh his ass off. He says, you're like Thunder Road. You're smuggling booze into Canada, you know? And all kinds of crazy stuff. I loved Mexico. Mexico was magical. I had friends from the Nespa. We would surf the Nespa alone. Some of the original guys that were there. I remember the only guy that lived there was Pat Tobin, the artist. He was a great guy. We would come down and hang out with Sophia. My friend who grew up and was raised there, we brought him up to Canada, and he loved it, man. He was great. We used to hang out in Mexico with those guys, and his brothers were growing marijuana up in the hills, and some of the craziest shit would go out in the boats. And one time they took me out in the boats, and we were loading marijuana. I said, I thought we were going fishing, you guys. And the Mexicans, and at night they say, well, it's time to go to sleep. And I said, how do you guys sleep out here? And the whole boat was full of fish blood and guts. And he says, you just take your clothes off and you slip down into the bloody slime and fall asleep. Nobody wants to believe this shit, but it's true. Some of the craziest stories of Baja. And then I ended up coming down here, getting caught in all the war zones. I almost got killed several times during the wars in Nicaragua. Driving down the roads, stopped this guy, said, why is these roads so fucked up? There's giant holes in the middle of the highway everywhere. And the guy looked at me and shook his head, and he says, those are from landmines. I called my Salvadorian friend. He says, what the fuck are you doing in this country? And I said, we're driving around looking for surf. He said, you are the only gringo in this whole fucking country. We were there at the time when they killed the nuns. And I remember going by Rio Nido and looking over the bridge and seeing a pile of bodies down there all shot and hacked up. I mean, some horrible stories, but I'd like to focus on the nice stuff and the good waves. When I first came down here, things were really tranquilo, very peaceful. Everybody was very law-abiding. Nicaragua was a beautiful country, even though it was run by Somoza. Salvador was great. People would drive down. There was Airstream trailers that would come down in groups from Texas. It was the Pan American Highway. It was a big thing. It was going to open up and be the new tourist boom. And then all of a sudden, things started to change in Guatemala. And that's when the Salvador was referring to when we were there. And the Civil War started out there. And then it branched out into Nicaragua. And then I was in Nicaragua prior to when Somoza was taken down by Ortega. What's driving these changes? In Nicaragua was the communists. The East Germans came over. The Russians came over. We were driving through Nicaragua, and they were goose-stepping, marching death to America. And we're in there in Nicaragua, we're going, what the fuck is going on here? You know? Costa Rica always was a peace-loving, welcoming country. We were here when La Piña, when they bombed Panama. We had a war in Panama and a war in Nicaragua and a war in El Salvador. We were surrounded by all this chaos. And the Colombians everything was just bubbling around us. That's when the Americans came in here and set up at Ollie's Point. There was all kinds of Secret Service people here. The DEA was here. And that's when the whole thing with the narcos started happening, and they started smuggling the drugs and blah, blah, blah. And it's just everything rolled into one big enchilada. You know, the salad days of the early days of peace and innocence, it changed rapidly. And it was a cultural thing that the surfers were caught in the middle of all over the place. The only thing we had was a shortwave radio to listen to. And I'd listen to the radio at night. And then one time my neighbors came over and woke me up and they said, all the Americans are killing themselves. And I went, what the fuck are you talking about? It was with Georgetown over in Guyana when they were all drinking the poison, right? I mean, the only thing we'd listen to is the radio here. So there was no internet, no phones, nothing, so it was a different world. It was a different world, but there always was surf. When I first came here, there was literally nobody even knew about this place. There was so few surfers in this whole country. People in Salvador would talk about Costa Rica like, there's really no surf down there. It's not worth going to. It's amazing how it seems like it was just yesterday. Close to 10 years of exploration all through Central America, Mexico, South America. I came to the conclusion that I loved this area in Costa Rica, and I also loved Mexico. So I used to live in Michoacan, and we would go and drive and post up and camp for months at a time at Conejo and surf Conejo. And all my friends would surf Scorpion. We'd go down to Pescadero and surf Cabo, catch the ferry. And I'd always thought of moving to Mexico. But then we decided that Costa Rica was the spot. So we came here, and in the early 80s, the squatters showed up. And they squatted this whole area. This was one giant farm, this whole area. And rumor has it was owned by Somoza. Because when they came to squat it, Somoza had already been blown to rat shit in Paraguay by a bazooka. There was no consequences. Nobody even came and disputed the squatters. I was here when they walked up and down the beach with a fishing line. It was 100 meters long and pointed into the jungle and said, "This is your land." And that's how they took the first land squatted. They squatted all the front land. I could see the people coming from all over the country to squat this beautiful area that was just completely pristine. We decided to purchase some land, which was extremely inexpensive. The first purchase of land was signed on a napkin with an X. The guy didn't even know how to sign his name. We had a $50 down payment and a note we had to pay within a year that was $300 for a hectare of property. All this stuff went down. It's a phenomenal history of how this place was settled. Nothing became multiple $1 million of property. I've talked to other people about it. They say there's probably not another place on the planet where land values have increased so proportionately in such a short period of time. It truly is a paradise. My motivation to stay here is because I love the Costa Ricans. I love the fact that they were nonviolent. If it was like, if you get in a fight, you may not get a machete. You may just get a punch in the nose, but chances are you're just going to get yelled at. Mexico, you might get shot. The people were really respectful here. We used to leave our houses open. The creeks were crystal clear water. You could drink the water out of the rivers. I felt like I was in Canada, but in the tropics, where when it rained, you weren't going to freeze to death. You didn't need the raincoats, nor did the girls. Okay, fast forward to 2024. 5 decades of cruising around surfing. It's a long time. It's a lot of waves, a lot of paddle outs. As a surfer, you'll always remember yourself when you're 20 years old. And even though the young guys will look at you and go, "Wow, you're still out here." It's great. I love this place. There's tons of waves. There's a lot of great people. And there's a good future here. There's, in spite of all the challenges, there's a lot of young people moving here. When we came here, we were some of the first people that stayed here over the rainy season. In those days, there was no bridges. You couldn't get out of here for days at a time. Sometimes the only way you could get out was walk, but we loved every minute of it. I raised my kids here. They loved it. I tried to take them back to Canada. After a year, they told me they were coming back to Costa Rica. I raised them in the jungle with candles. They look back on their childhood as the most valuable thing they have. They learned cultural experience. They're both bilingual, bicultural. There's a lot of families moving here now. There's new schools. There's a lot of positive stuff going on, along with the dark side. But hey, that's where it is everywhere. We have wonderful days here, and if you get up early in the morning, chances are you're going to get some nice waves. And chances are you might get them just with you and your buddy.
Everybody's talented and everybody's stoned, and I feel like I wanna go back home. And everybody's wasted and everybody's cool, and I feel like I'm back in high school.
Thank you for watching All Waves Considered. I've been your host here. Catch a few waves. Enjoy the day. Thank you.